Welcome back to Startups for the Rest of Us. I'm your host, Rob Walling. Every week on this show, we cover topics related to building and growing ambitious yet sane startups. We look at building companies not as, a vanity project, a way to get power and status in the world, but we think about it as a way to improve our lives, to bring us freedom and purpose and allow us to maintain healthy relationships. It's not about being a total bootstrapper. It's not about raising buckets of venture funding. It's about being capital efficient and building a company that serves perhaps multiple purposes rather than just being an IPO in 10 years, but that actually changes our lives or those around us. Welcome back to the show. Thank you so much for joining me again today. We're going to be covering bootstrapper news today with Tracy Osborne. I'm excited to talk about it. We have some pretty interesting stories, actually. Stack Overflow was acquired for $1.8 billion, came as a total surprise to me. Just a few minutes prior to recording this, Moz was acquired. We talk about people quitting instead of giving up remote work. And we wrap up the episode by talking about remote work and remote retreats. And if you are a remote team, how often to think about getting together. We also talk about a few highlights from our 2020 batch of founders and talk about what we feel like went well with that. And that kind of dovetails into the whole remote conversation of not being able to get together for retreats during this batch here and how that we feel like that impacted us and perhaps, the cohesion of the batch itself. And today I'm talking these topics through with Tracy Osborne. She's Tracy Makes on Twitter. And of course, she is the managing director of Tiny Seed and author of Hello Web Design. Within the first few minutes of us chatting, you'll get to see that book hot off the presses. She had self-published it and then later went through a publisher and has a nice hardcover copy. So with that, let's dive into today's show. Tracy Osborne, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, happy to be back.
Last time you were on, you were talking about your book, Hello Web Design. Before that, we did a Bootstrapper news episode. You're getting the book out. Yeah. Is that a physical hard cover of your book?
Yeah, it is a hardcover. The publishing company wanted to up the quality of it. So apologies to anyone who's listening in audio format. So just imagine a book that's hardcover. Used to be paperback. It looks really nice now. And it's, I don't know the exact date it's coming out, but it's going to be this month. I know some people have already gotten their books. So yeah.
Oh, that's cool.
Listen to the last episode where I talked about my design book. You'll get the link to buy my book that teaches entrepreneurs how to design. Sorry, I have to put a pitch in there. This is the perfect opportunity.
NoStarchPress.com/Tracy Osborne's book. No, it's like /hello-web-
hello-web-design.
So, and before that, you and Einar Volstead were on the show to talk about Bootstrapper news. We've had all kinds of conversations around this. Einar is out of the office today. He's taking a day off, mental health day. No, he's just relaxing, personal day. And so it winds up being you and I here recording. Thanks for doing it last minute. I found myself at the end of the week saying, I have no episode next week. So it's great.
I like how you just admitted that.
Yeah.
I wasn't going to say anything, but yes, I'm very happy to always to be the person you go to when you are in a pinch.
Scrambling. Yeah, that was the thing. It doesn't happen very often. I mean, I often record at least a couple weeks ahead, or I get stuff done Tuesday, Wednesday for the following week. But I don't know. This week there was a lot going on and a lot of email, but we are going to be talking through news and other topics. We even have a listener question I might throw in depending on how time works out. And this is stuff that's related, I think, to developers, designers, founders, bootstrappers, and such, the folks who would listen to this podcast. The first story, what's funny is I hadn't heard about it, and it wasn't until I was digging through a bunch of social news sites for news over the past couple weeks that I read that Stack Overflow sold to a tech giant that I'd never heard of called Prosus, Prosus, for $1.8 billion. And it says that it's Prosus's biggest investment in online learning and comes weeks after it sold a chunk from its massive Tencent holding. Stack Overflow, this is like this site. I mean, I listened to Joel and Jeff when they were launching Stack Overflow. They had a podcast around it. And I was, I'm an early account. I don't think I ever answered a question, but this is like a mainstay for our communities. What's your take of this?
I like how I haven't answered a question ever either, which just makes me kind of feel I've gotten so much out of Stack Overflow. Whatever I'm programming, like any programmer, I'm using it on the minute, every minute, it seems like, when I'm trying to debug something. This is interesting to me because, one of the reasons why I work at Tiny Seed is that I'm a big fan of smaller companies and trying to enable a lot of people on the internet to launch small things. And I love small teams. This goes into real life for me. I I do small businesses, not big conglomerates, whatnot. And it's been interesting to see the trends we have in kind of, I want to say, the physical world of consolidation of businesses like news industries, and seeing that move into online industries. And you can see that here with Process, which I had never heard of either, for being such a giant, like a tech giant. I guess it's South African. I've never heard of them. And when I was kind of researching a little bit for this story, kind of looking at all of the different acquisitions and properties they have that are all around kind of online learning, and seeing how it looks like they have this plan to go through all these online learning websites, supposedly keeping them independent, and they're still running on their own, but they're still consolidating all these online learning websites, kind of leads me to wonder about what's going to look like in, say, 5 or so years, as these companies are getting acquired and consolidated. And are we going to have these like mega corporations that are kind of pushing for a certain way of learning when it comes to like online learning, like pushing for certain ways of learning, or being more, I don't know, I want to say like anti-democratic. You know what I mean? When like a big company comes in and takes over these small companies, and then all of a sudden they all start looking the same. They all kind of have the same processes and whatnot. And on one hand, it's like more efficient. On the other hand, I kind of mourn for like the freedom of these small businesses. So I might be going like way too broad here, but it made me think about like news corporations and consolidation there, and then kind of seeing this happen in tech world. And, just I kind of miss I told you earlier, I kind of miss the 90s, where it seemed like everyone was just individuals running websites. And now we have these like mega corporations that are running things that I use actively, and kind of makes me wonder how it's going to look in the short future.
I wonder if you're the only person that misses the 90s, because, man, the fashion was terrible. I guess the music was pretty good, but no, I'm joking. Very fond memories of the 90s. But the
Frame websites filled with, like, we'd have all this like front-end developments nonsense. I just built it with frames. Anyways, sorry, go ahead.
The thing is, like with any industry, there's always a bunch of players, and then consolidation has been inevitable, right? Where it's like there were 100 car manufacturers in the US, and now there are 3. And there were 100 airplane manufacturers, and now there are a handful around the world. And there were a bazillion TV stations, right? And then it became just 3. Maybe that one's not true, but radio. I mean, each of these things have consolidated. TV is the one where it got distribution and cable, and it actually expanded. But then there's only a handful of companies now that own them. Even if they're, there's NBC and CBS and AMC or whatever, but they're only owned by a handful of companies. So I hear you on wanting the days back where it's small players. Because, like, again, Joel Spolsky started a little software company called Fog Creek Software in 99 or 2000, started blogging, and then starts Stack Overflow. He was the CEO until 2019, I found out, and then he became the chairman. At that point, when the founder steps away, or one of the founders steps away from being CEO, I feel like the clock is ticking for an exit. And this type of thing where they did raise venture funding, I think a lot of us were surprised, because Joel was, one of the few bootstrappers. Like, he was the first person I'd ever heard who started a software company without raising venture funding. As shocking as that sounds today, in 2001, I was like, you can do that? That's a thing? Like, I literally didn't know that was possible, and just every model I had seen was someone raising funding. So when they raised for Stack Overflow, I remember being super surprised. And Joel was like, look, certain types of businesses, if you want to have certain types of outcomes, you need buckets of money. And to do Stack Overflow the way they wanted to do it, with all the exchange, the stack exchanges and all the stuff, that was what they wanted to do. And once you raise that level of money that they did, true venture, not tiny seed money, right? Not angel money, the clock starts ticking, right? You have to have a liquidity event. So they needed to IPO, or they needed to sell at a certain point. And I think the beauty of it, like, I look at it as, I think it's cool for Joel and Jeff Atwood and the founders, or whoever had equity in this, that they built something amazing, and that they now walk away with boatloads of money to be able to invest in and fund future entrepreneurs. I, of course, am concerned about Stack Overflow itself. I don't use it, at all anymore, unless I'm helping my son troubleshoot a 3D printer driver or something. But so, of course, when a private equity, I don't know if Process is private equity or venture equity, or what they are exactly. I guess I could have actually done some research, but basically they're some type of big conglomerate investment, that's rolling things up. But I'm excited about the things that can now, where are the opportunities? There's always opportunity for scrappy entrepreneurs to come in? And is it Stack Overflow is not going to be good, so we can all should we all start a new Stack Overflow? That would be a competitor. That would be crazy. You wouldn't have done that while Joel was running it because they would win. Or I guess there's just a lot more money in the startup ecosystem with Jeff Atwood and Joel and the other founders having this money to reinvest. I think back in startups. I think that's something that they will do. They will do interesting things with the money. They're not going to go retire on a beach somewhere. They're going to start their next company, or they're going to help, other entrepreneurs. So, but I'm a silver lining person when it comes to this stuff, because there's definitely, as you're saying, there's both sides of it. There's a negative take, I think, that is very real. It's a real possibility.
Yeah, I just looked it up, actually. Process has stakes in companies. I mean, it still has a stake in Tencent, but they also have other education companies like Brainly, Codecademy, Udemy, Remitly, PayU. So some things I haven't heard of and some things I have. So it gives you an idea in terms of their ecosystem there. When I say something about like consolidation and mourning it, like when I think about like radio stations, it's you see the radio stations consolidate and kind of get more bland and boring and vanilla because there's no like local radio stations, and it's harder, I think, for individuals for radio to start up their own thing. But with tech, and like that's the thing that makes me like optimistic about what we can do on the internet, what we can do as like tech entrepreneurs, is that if Stack Overflow does, if it goes in a direction that people don't want, then it's easier to start something new and, kind of pull out those features, pull out anything that, like, say, doesn't work anymore, Stack Overflow, as they make changes, if they make changes, and that the internet can evolve pretty quickly to kind of fill in that gap as compared to, say, some of these more, say, physical businesses. So that brings me a little bit of comfort. Obviously, I don't want Stack Overflow to change. Again, as someone who is, I've never given back, which is not necessarily a good thing. But I appreciate for all the people out there who have spent the time and unpaid work to answer people's questions. And I hope that kind of community sticks around post-acquisition.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, because starting a new car company today would be very, very difficult, as we've seen with Elon Musk and Tesla. Even though with all the money and all the influence and network he had, it's been a real uphill battle for him, versus starting a competitor Stack Overflow. The network effect would be really hard, right? The two-sided marketplace aspect of it, but way more possible, than starting a car company. It's interesting because we have another story. I don't know that we need to cover like in depth, but literally 33 minutes ago, the story broke that Moz was acquired by iContact. And I get a text from Einar and I'm like, wow, it's going to happen, but I'm always surprised when it does. And really, why should I be surprised? Again, it's a venture-backed business that was doing, I think, $70 million a year last year. SaaS app. It's worth a lot of money. The founder left a few years ago to start SparkToro. And it's probably natural that they, the new CEO they brought in was to kind of groom it and get it in line for an exit. And we don't have any details about price or about outcome or anything, but this is another thing. I think this is the critique of venture capital is that they don't build businesses for the long term, right? Because there does have to be this liquidity event, usually a sale. But what's interesting is I've realized over the past several years, like IPO, obviously also a liquidity event, and an IPO is just raising funding from the public. And if you know what I mean? It's a lot of people will say like, oh, they IPO and they sold out or they sold everything. And it's like, no, it's just they sold another 10 or 20%, just like a funding round. And oftentimes the founders or the current CEO will stick around for that.
Yeah, I didn't get that for a long time either. Like IPOs felt like this big, it is still like a giant event and whatnot, but it's still, like you said, if you just, it's the same thing, taking a bit of your company instead of going to private investors or going public. Looking at the Moz thing, it's also, I am looking forward to seeing what news comes out of this. I hopefully will hear from Brand soon, and I hope that it worked out well for him. But like iContact is another company where it's like, oh, they're acquiring Moz to form a suite of leading SEO, email, and digital marketing solutions for small and mid-sized businesses. So it's another example of this like consolidation, a bigger company being like, okay, we need another company in our portfolio. So we have this full portfolio, this full ecosystem of different tools. And I guess we'll just see what happens with Moz too. Yeah.
And that's it. The plus of this is hopefully Rand and whoever else had equity and the investors walk away with enough money that they now are reinvesting back in the ecosystem. Rand himself, even before this exit, is an investor in Tiny Seed. He's a mentor at Tiny, like he's giving back to the entrepreneurial community in ways that his means have allowed. And if Rand has more means he will, I think, give back more. So that's the plus side of this. And of course, the negative side is if you're a Moz customer, things are going to change, right? They're pretty likely to. That's where it's good that we do have competitors, right? SEMrush, Ahrefs, there are other tools out there that do similar things. So it's just a bummer if you've been using a tool for 10 years, it gets sold, you're waiting for the inevitable changes. The playbook, as you said earlier, these things all start to be run the same. And it's the playbook, right? It's the private equity or the strategic playbook.
I know, got to bring the people in to make sure everything efficient, and that efficiency is reflected across every one of their properties, and then everything looks the same.
Yep, and I think don't do this, but if you read the Hacker News comments for any of this, no, you're inevitably, or even just the comments on anything, you're going to see things like, the founders sold out. You hear this phrase, or it's almost this like, no one should ever sell their company. And you know what? That's just not realistic because people don't want to run the same company for 40 years. A, it gets boring. B, there's a lot of risk. You can have you can have tens of millions of dollars in net worth tied up in an asset that you have no liquidity in. So it just doesn't make sense. It's usually said from someone who's never built a company worth tens of millions of dollars a year who is saying these things, Of course, do things sometimes get worse after a company's sold? Of course. But there's a flip side. Are there silver linings to this as well?
Yeah. I mean, the service more stable because there's more tech support within the company, more AT, more of that, like more personnel. Are they able to add more features quickly? Are they able to be, the consolidation with other parts of the suite is that, I'm thinking of Microsoft. Microsoft has a whole suite of applications. A lot of these applications all talk to each other. So there's a lot of benefits there as well when you opt into some of these conglomerates.
Yeah. It is still disconcerting, though. I'll admit.
Right.
Next story. We're going to link up all these stories. This is on Bloomberg.com, and it says employees are quitting instead of giving up working from home. The drive to get people back into offices is clashing with workers who've embraced remote work as the new normal. And it, talks about someone who is called into the office for a 6-minute in-person meeting or something. And she's like, that's it. I'm quitting. My brother lives in the Bay Area. Most of my family does, actually. And he said that he is friends with some folks who work at Apple, and they lived near him. And when the remote work started, they moved like a 2-hour drive away because the houses are so much cheaper and you can get a view and all this stuff. Or maybe it was even 2.5 hours. And he's like, they think they're going to be remote forever. And I think they're not. I don't think Apple's going remote with the big flying saucer campus there. And what are they going to do when they come back, or when that happens? And so we were chatting about that. And I said, boy, if they're developers or they have like skills, they can just work remote for someone else, probably, So what's your take on this?
I mean, ignoring COVID, this is just like what happened with Yahoo, right? Because they had a remote policy, and then Marissa Mayer came in, and then it was like, oh, we're canceling the remote policy. Everyone has to come back into the office because there's still this pervasive idea that productivity is tied to butts and seats. And so it was like, oh, look, we're taking this company, we're going to make it more productive by bringing people to the office, and we're going to have all those like the quote unquote benefits of having butts and seats. So that was pre-COVID. And, I think Yahoo is its own thing. Like, who knows what's going on with Yahoo now? But I remember that happening in the Bay Area, and COVID happened, and that forced all these companies to adopt a remote policy. But I feel like that's going to be the same. It's the same thing. It's COVID's lessening. The pandemic is lessening. It's allowing people to get fully vaccinated, have the possibility of people going back to the office, and companies in ill-advised pursuit of efficiency and managers who have maybe not a lot of confidence in their teams, or they don't, are insecure managers, I want to say, are going to pursue bringing people back in the office so they can not have like the question over their head of, are my workers being as efficient as possible? So it's not something I agree with. Like, we've always been 100% remote. I love working remote. I just look at Yahoo. I look at what's going on right now. And this is like duh. It's like watching these companies force people to come back into the office. People are going to quit because now they realize there's more opportunities out there. I expected the companies to do this. What is different now is that so many companies are going to be adopting more remote work, that these companies that have, say, insecure managers and insecure C-suite teams that want to move people into the office, now they have more competition. Now that their workforce is aware of remote work, and that I hope that I watch the industry. People are going to be trying to adopt these policies. People are going to be quitting. Other opportunities are going to show up that are fully remote. And that, again, 5 or so years from now, there is going to be a major shift in the industry that started now because of COVID. So I'm not surprised, but I expect that, this is going to be hopefully a long-term change. And these companies that have, insecurities around productivity, I expect them to have this reaction, but hopefully they'll change.
It's interesting because I'm much less black and white on remote being the end all be all. Every company I've ever run has been remote or half remote. In Fresno, we were partially.
Yeah, I didn't mention that. Yeah, I'm not black and white either, and I didn't really go into that. I actually think Tiny Seed, I wish we were half remote. I would love to work with you like 2 days out of the week.
Yep. That's my ideal.
So I think that is ideal for these companies as well. The black and white thing is like whether fully remote versus fully in office. Like there's a lot of gray there. Sorry, continue.
Yeah, no, that's the tough part is every time I talk about remote, I talk about the best setup I ever had, and it was in Fresno, and there were 5 of us or 6 of us, I forget how many were in, and it was 2.5 days a week for me, and some people showed up 3, and actually I think Anna worked there 5 days a week in the office because it was just better she liked it better. She was alone half the time anyways because none of us were there, but we were able to whiteboard. We had a lunch meeting, our staff meeting was lunch, and we'd go out on Thursday, right? I mean, it was the best, and then I could go home, put the headphones on, and not worry about having to drive in those days. But it's really hard to do that. I guess not for Apple, I guess. It's hard to do that if you're a small company or a bootstrapper, because if you're going to pay for an office anyways, that's a cost if you're only using it half the time. In addition, then it does restrict you to, I can only hire within a 30, 45 minute drive and so you live in Canada, Einar's in California, I'm in Minneapolis, producer Xander with Microconf is in Hawaii. Like if I had to hire everyone in Minneapolis, we wouldn't have the team we have, right? So it instantly breaks that. So I really struggle with it.
It's the same thing. If you were like, okay, Tiny Seed, COVID is over, we're going to pursue being in person in Minneapolis. Like I would have to quit.
Yeah.
So it's like the same thing as a lady. I'm like, I don't want to, but I have to because I'm here. And and I feel like that's going to happen in a lot of these companies where, like you said, like the example of someone who moved out of the Bay Area 2 hours out so they have a lower cost of living is going to be very unwilling to come back into that high cost of living area. And so that's maybe where this change is going to happen. It's just going to be interesting. There's companies that can make this work. My first job out of university was at a tech company. That's my example of the insecure manager, because over the 4.5 years I was there, they kept adding more and more policies to make us more efficient. So A, we were all in the office. B, we started clocking in and clocking out. C, bonuses were tied to us working 9 hours a day rather than 8. So if you only worked 8 hours a day, we were not eligible for any bonuses. And so these policies kept adding up because they're just like, we want to extract all the productivity. Curious how they're doing now with COVID. I eventually quit because of that.
Oh, absolutely. Hours do not equal productivity. And that's the thing is my kind of shades of gray or my spectrum view of this is not because I think, I'm going to get more productivity out of people or I can make sure they're in their seats those 2 or 3 days a week. It is purely for the social interaction because, a lot of the companies that say we're fully remote, Basecamp's the typical example, they're all remote. From what I've heard, they hired a bunch of introverts, and everyone in the world is not an introvert. And the extroverts I know don't love working remote. And especially, I have worked remote 20 years. Literally 2 decades of working remote. I had a couple stints in there where I had jobs for a year or 2, but in general, I've had a home office. Sometimes that was a desk in my living room when we had a small house or in my bedroom during COVID when I didn't have room. But I generally prefer remote, but I also miss a lot of the social. And it purely is social and the ability to sit in front of a whiteboard or to hash things out and to talk about, it's that water cooler conversation that just doesn't happen because you're not hanging out all day. You just have other kind of wild thoughts that you drop on someone and that sparks something. And then there's a brainstorm and then there's a, hey, can you, and that's what I miss rather than being the manager. But I also understand, I think of Apple, with thousands of people, that would be tough for me. There have to be people that are just totally abusing it, at that scale, right? At our scale, there's 4 of us, or at the drip scale, there were 10 of us. That was pretty easy for me to see. who was shipping, what we were getting done, and to know that everybody was in on it. But if we were 100 or 1,000, I mean, I'll say once we were absorbed into Lead Pages, which was about 170 plus us, so it was about 180 people total. It was 3 days in the office, 2 days work from home. There were absolutely people that were kind of slacking off, and that's tough. And I don't know how quite to handle that, other than to require people be in the office.
Yeah. I mean, that happens if you're in the office all the time too.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, I'm not saying that not to defend myself, but I got really irritated at that one company constantly tracking hours. And one other thing they did was I wasn't allowed to have my phone out because then I could potentially be looking at my email on work hours. This is crazy. I wish I could name and shame them, but I'm not going to.
I know. I can't even. This is
I'll tell you stories later. Ugh. But what I did, I just stared at the corner. I would just take breaks and stare at the corner of the wall and kind of let myself drift off because there was no way that it can stop me because I was just so mad at their policies. Anyways, that's going off track, but it's a funny story. What I want to say is that still happens. There's still going to be workers out there that are maybe not performing as well as they could have. Maybe they're a worker that the company might want to hire a person to replace that person. Maybe they're not as, I don't like tying everything to productivity, but you know what I mean? The person is not necessarily a good fit for the company. That doesn't matter whether they're remote or all in person. What it means is that companies need to have better ways of tracking the quality of work. Instead of just being hours in the office, like that company that I originally work at, that we're doing all we could. The person's here all the time. Why are, this is as efficient as we could be. Look at other metrics. And then those metrics can apply to whether someone is in the office or out of the office. And so hopefully this forces companies to remove butts and seats and find other ways of tracking quality of work and productivity and whatnot. And if those things apply to in person or out of person, I think that overall it's going to be better for the company anyways.
I love that you just said in person or out of person. That makes me feel like I'm leaving my body. I'm floating. That's
what my brain does. I'm thinking 2 sentences ahead and forgetting what I'm currently talking about.
It's all good. Our next story is actually, so it is a Twitter thread I'm going to be posting next week. I guess maybe I'll post it the day before or day that this episode goes live, but it is about Tiny Seed and the end of our second batch, which is our 2020 batch. And we put together, I want to be careful, audience, listener who's sitting here listening, this is not going to be a big hooray for us or hooray for Tiny Seed thing, but I did want to visit some milestones that some Batch 2 folks achieved, as well as reflect on things that we did well and some things that maybe need to work on, as well as just the structure. Someone asked me in the last couple of weeks, how do you run a fully remote accelerator? And why were you running a remote accelerator before anyone else, right? Because we were running that pre-COVID. Now, all accelerators have been remote for the last year, but we orchestrated and architected this to work that way. So,
actually this ties into our previous conversation when you're talking about tracking performance and quality and not necessarily be butts and seats, but more, for us, some context around this is that before in the first batch, we were able to talk to our accelerator, the founders in the accelerator in person at MicroConf, and we're able to say, how was this year for you? And kind of get the down low. And of course, fully remote, we were able to do that. So we have anonymous surveys because we want to know how well the accelerator is doing, which is especially important being that most of the people, actually I met a few people in batch 2, our 2020 batch at MicroConf, but most people I've never met in person. And this is the only way we can, we have a gut feel for how the year went, but how does this look from the founder side of things? How well did this year go, even being that we had no in-person events and we had to do everything remotely?
That's right. Because if you think that hiring someone remote is difficult, imagine writing someone a $120,000 or $180,000 check remote, having never met them and only being able to talk to them via Zoom and email. So a couple numbers. So our first batch, our 2019 batch was 10 founders. 2020 batch that just ended was 13. And our spring 2021 batch, oh man, it's a lot. Spring 2021 batch is 18. But the 13 companies in our 2020 batch grew an average of 413% during the accelerator year. And while fundraising is not an implied goal of Tiny Seed, we had, I guess is one company who who secured their pre-seed round and 2 others who were basically about to wrap it up. We had our first acquisition, which was Sequel.
Woo-hoo.
Yeah, and the founder of Sequel was on this very podcast just probably about 6 months ago. And so ThoughtSpot acquired them. Had some great milestones. Like Scraping Bee is great because they are very public with their revenues. We can actually say, exactly, not just percentage stuff, but Scraping Bee was at 40K ARR when they applied, or I don't know if it's when they applied or the batch started, but now they're at north of $500,000 ARR. And the founders there told us that, Tiny Seed played a huge part in that. And then Segmetrics, many of you know Keith Perhack. He's a longtime microconfer and has been on this podcast. Segmetrics grew 10 times in the last 12 months, and they're on track to hit mid-7 figures ARR by the end of this year. So a lot of cool milestones. Pretty stoked about it. It was a big bummer that we couldn't meet in person. Like that's my biggest, it's not a regret because it's like you can't do anything else. But the fact that we weren't, as you said, able to make that connection, I think was a pretty big struggle.
Yeah. I mean, like we always knew it's going to be remote. And we wanted to help companies and these founders grow their businesses, help them reach what you say, escape velocity, which I think some of those stats, we were successful in helping some of those companies reach those milestones. But a huge thing is also just kind of community between founders and allowing, especially for solo founders, we talked to a lot of our solo founders, it gives them a sounding board, people to talk to, and all these things that we can do remotely fairly well. But there's something about getting in person and having this group of people all together in person. I mean, it's the same thing as a company. Working remotely is fine with you and me and Xander and Einar, but it's like a different feel when you do have those like in-person meetings, in-person events and whatnot. And so that was, it's a bummer that we were able to like have a lot of community. That is something that I do feel there's a difference in feeling between the 2019 and 2020 batches. And I think it has to do with the fact that there wasn't any in-person events. We're hopefully to have like as things open up this fall, we are planning to have some sort of in-person event, like a makeup retreat for the 2020 batch, hopefully to kind of add that in at the end and kind of solidify all those relationships we were able to do remotely. But I will say that I do feel like there was a different feel, and it was interesting to have that experience, I guess. And I think when we did that anonymous survey, thankfully, it seems like people still got a lot out of the program without those in-person events. I am looking forward to bringing them back in, though, and kind of reestablishing that side of Tiny Seed.
Yeah, it's a big deal. It makes a huge difference. And I think, when we originally started Tiny Seed, we said, let's have 4 in-person retreats per year. And that means that every 4 months, you essentially get together. And the founders told us, this is too often. Like, I'm busy and I don't want to travel every 4 months. So then we made it 6 months apart, which means you have 3 retreats.
So beginning of the program, end of the program, and middle of the program, to be clear.
Yep, every 6 months. And that, I think we haven't had a chance to do that yet, but I feel like that's going to be perhaps our optimum cadence. And the reason I'm calling this out is, what if we were running a team, let's say we were a team of 20 people. Would 6 months be the optimal cadence? Or would we want to meet more frequently, like every 3 or 4 months? Because I know that there are certain companies that only have one, I think Zapier has like 1 retreat a year. There's a lot of people working there, right? It's like they spend $250,000 or something, or more to get them together. So it's not something they can do, they could probably want to do every quarter. But what do you think would be the optimal? Because working with founders is one thing, and they're busy and they're doing their thing, and we get together and we mastermind, but we are not managing them as teammates, as employees, versus an actual team that's working together in a startup. What's your take on optimum cadence of face-to-face?
So one of the reasons why we went from 4 to 3 was because we talked to the founders in the first batch, and 4 retreats per year meant more time away from their family, more time away from their company. So it's different when it comes to, like, say, a team, because that, maybe 4 retreats per year or whatever you choose, it's not technically time away from the company. You're still working on your company while you're at those retreats. So I think that's the biggest difference between retreats for founders who are working on a company versus, say, a Tiny Seed, if Tiny Seed was like 80 people. So I think it's really important for companies to have those in-person experiences. And those are the kind of things that don't necessarily take away from work, because instead of working on, say, the nitty-gritty day-to-day, that gives you that time that you should be doing as a company anyways to think high level, what's the next 3, 6, whatnot months. And that's something that I think it depends on the company on how remote they are. If you are very international, every 3 months would suck. Every year, I think, is doable.
Yeah, if you're going to get your team together, we're talking about founder stuff, but if you have a team at a startup and you're going to get them together, like I found a really nice cadence is to have about half the time be work and half the time be not. And that's, or it's even like 2/3 not work, where you have a work session in the morning, maybe through lunch or early afternoon, and then you have an afternoon fun hangout, and then you have a dinner fun hangout. And usually, if you can, have a dinner fun hangout the night before, because everyone gets in and it's like, oh man, I haven't seen you in a while. So you're a lot taller than I thought you'd be. You have all that weird stuff and you're chatting. And then by the time you get to the work session the next morning, you have some type of agenda, right? And we do masterminds, but that wouldn't make sense if you're a team of, 5, 10, 50 people. But you do have an agenda of like, these are things we're going to hammer through. And then there is space for other things to crop up. And then again, after you leave that in the early afternoon, usually that's then a bunch of time to continue that conversation and let it go wherever. That's where it goes naturally, That's the best part.
Yeah, the spontaneity, the little things that you don't expect.
Yep. Tracy Osborne, thank you so much for joining me today. You are Tracy Makes on Twitter and tracyosborne.com if folks want to keep up with what you're up to.
Yeah, and if you are looking to pick up some design skills, I have a beginner design book that is being published through No Starch called Hello Web Design. So if you Google for that, you'll probably find it on the internet. But it's a republished book. I originally self-published it. It was successful. I was able to sell it to a publisher. So that's how you know there's a stamp of approval. It is good work. So if you're looking to looking to add design skills on top of your current stack, check out my book.
Awesome. Thanks again for joining me.
Thank you. Nice being here.
Thanks again for joining me today. I got a 5-star review, one of the best podcasts for SaaS founders. It's from Only One DA. Thank you, Rob. Loving the podcast. It's motivating me to keep going. We have 906 worldwide ratings, 397 worldwide reviews across 47 countries. If you haven't left us a rating, that'd be awesome. I'm on a drive to get to 1,000. I want 4 figures of 5-star reviews. I really appreciate you listening all these years. Every week since 2010, we've been talking about bootstrapping, mostly bootstrapping, building ambitious yet capital efficient companies that change our lives. And I hope you join me again next Tuesday morning.